Ascendancy is a class's specialization in Path of Exile 2. In the previous guide, we covered how to unlock Ascendancy in Act 2. In this guide, we'll be covering how to unlock an additional 2 points to invest in your Ascendancy, which requires unlocking and completing the Trials of Chaos in Act 3. As usual, useful timestamps can be found in the video description. Let's start with how to unlock the Trials of Chaos. Not long into Act 3, during the main quest Legacy of the Val, we will need to journey into the Chimeral Wetlands. The exact location of this boss is determined somewhat randomly, but I found the Deadly Nest near the west end of the wetlands. There, we will need to defeat Zyclusian the Chimera. While I wouldn't go as far as to say this boss is easy, it is easier than Bahlak from Act 2. Just knock down the stone altars it perches on to get in some easy damage. Upon defeat, this boss will drop the Chimeral Inscribed Ultimatum quest item, which will start us on the Trials of Chaos quest. Again, the exact location of this destination may vary, but we should find the Temple of Chaos somewhere else within the Chimeral Wetlands. For me, it was near the northern border. To begin the Trial of Chaos, we will need to interact with the Offering Altar and slot in our Inscribed Ultimatum, then click Open. The entrance to the trial will open and then we can enter to start. As a quick heads up, if we die during our attempt of this trial, we can start it over by interacting with the Offering Altar, hitting the Close option, then hitting Open again. Now let's get into the Trials of Chaos mechanics and my general tips on how to complete it because it is quite challenging. We'll talk about the challenge modifiers, a specific round of the trial that can be tricky to figure out, and then end of trial bosses. First, we luckily do not have to worry about the honor mechanic for this trial. However, we do have to deal with a new challenge modifier each round, with 4 rounds of the trial in total, and these modifiers range from fairly benign to extremely detrimental. Because of that, let's go through several choices and which modifiers are the worst and best to pick. First, Stalking Shade is not a terrible choice, at least if you are only 1 or 2 rounds from completing the trial. It is an intimidating one though. Chaotic Monsters is also not terrible, but it definitely adds to the lethality of monsters. Finally, Impending Doom falls under what I would call the obstacle category of challenge modifiers, and these are, in my opinion, the absolute worst. At least one of the potential end bosses for this trial is extremely difficult and has tons of AoE attacks to avoid already. Adding in an obstacle modifier makes it near impossible to avoid getting hit a lot. So for those reasons, and since this is the first round of the trial, I went with Chaotic Monsters. Next up, Unstoppable Monsters is not too bad if you don't rely on slowed or stunned, and does nothing to prevent the effects of freeze. Heart Tethers is another obstacle modifier, and so should be avoided at all costs. Finally, there is Lessened Reach. This modifier is fairly benign, and it's actually pretty helpful for my Frost Sorceress build, which benefits from slow-moving projectiles. For our third round of modifiers, Monster Speed does make things more challenging, but it's not too bad when compared to other potential choices. Reduced Recovery, on the other hand, is fairly detrimental. Finally, Enraged Bosses is a definite no-go in my opinion. These end-of-trial bosses are already the most difficult part of the trial, and that's without getting an extra boost to damage and beefiness. For the fourth round of modifiers, we have Petrification Statues, and it's another obstacle modifier that we will avoid like the plague. Chaotic Monsters 2 just adds to the extra damage enemies will do, and so it's best if we can avoid it. Finally, Volatile Fiends, and this is actually not a bad choice if you are going into the final round of the trial, as there will only be one enemy, which is the boss. Moving on, Drought is not so bad if you have flasks with the modifier that recovers charges of the flask every second, such as 0.15 or 0.2 flask charges every second. Otherwise, it can be pretty detrimental depending on how many flasks you normally use. Stormcaller Runes is one of the absolute worst obstacle modifiers, and we've already mentioned that Reduced Recovery is pretty darn bad. Real quick, I want to show what Stormcaller Runes does on the end of trial boss fight. Basically, if you'll take note of all the red rings taking up arena space, those are the spots where you cannot stay standing on if you don't want to get hit by lightning. But I digress. Back to the modifiers, blood globules is another obstacle modifier and so should be avoided. Damaged defenses is also really detrimental and will cut energy shields in half. It's still better than an obstacle modifier though, in my opinion. Burning turrets or turrets of any type are also a detrimental obstacle modifier, especially on boss fights. Whereas time paradox is not so bad as long as you don't heavily rely upon buffs for your playstyle. No defenses is one of the most detrimental modifiers for classes that rely on energy shields or high armor. Deadly monsters is also very bad, and our last choice was burning turrets, so there was really no winning here. Toxic monsters is bad but not terrible, and the same can be said for entangling monsters. Pyramid beams, on the other hand, is very bad and should be avoided. Okay, with that, let's move on to the one trial round that can be a bit confusing, and that is the collect all the soul cores round, or at least one variant of it. To complete it, we will first need to pull the switch that is to the left of the stone altars. We can then go back up the lift that we initially rode down on and cross the bridge. Our first soul core will be to the left. After grabbing it, we'll need to hurry back to the stone altars to deposit it, as holding a soul core slowly drains shield and life. With that done, we can return to the top of the lift and head partway back to the first soul core location. However, we'll want to stop at the lever along the way and interact with it. This will cause a path to our right to rise up, which we can cross over to reach the second soul core. After bringing that soul core back, we can pull the first lever, the one to the left of the stone altars, and move towards the northwest to find the final soul core. Once all soul cores have been deposited into stone altars, the round will end and we can move on to the next room. Now let's talk about the end of trial bosses. There are 3 that I know of, and 2 are relatively manageable, and 1 is extremely difficult. At least that was my experience with them. Let's start with the hard one, which is Bahlak the Skyseer. I fought this boss at least 4 times and was defeated every single time. I don't have any great tips on how to defeat this boss, so your best bet is to get lucky and not have this be your final boss of the trial. That being said, if you do manage to defeat this boss, I would be very curious to hear how in the comments. Compared to Bahlak, the other 2 bosses are a walk in the park. Chetza, the Feathered Plague, was, at least for me, very weak to ice. It went down extremely fast to ice wall spam. Also, it does summon an ad partway through the fight, but I was pretty easily able to just ignore it. As you may also notice, I had the Impending Doom modifier for this fight, and that was also pretty easy to avoid. The third and final boss is Uxmal the Beast Lord. This boss is a tad bit more difficult and a little annoying as it will fly to different areas of the arena throughout the fight. However, it was still much easier when compared to Bahlak. In any case, once we defeated all 4 rounds of the Trials of Chaos, including the final boss, we can move on to the reward room. After looting the Trial Rewards chest there, we can approach the Altar of Ascendancy that is just beyond and interact with it. This will just pop up our Ascendancy but won't allow us to allocate our new passive points into it. For that, we will need to go to the Passives tab under the Character menu. I'm not sure if we can get any more Ascendancy points during early access, but I will be sure to make a new guide if I find that out to be the case. Please check the pinned comment of this video where I will update it with useful information as time goes on. You can also reach out to me in the comments with any questions where I will do my best to help. If you want to see more great guides, you can head over to my channel, and if you're new, consider subscribing. You're helping me feed my cat. Her name's Marshmallow. Have a great day. If you're here today, have a great Tuesday, and as always, thanks for watching.